Alexandre Baril is an associate professor at the University of Ottawa. His work is situated at the crossroads of gender, queer, trans, disability, crip, med studies, critical gerontology, and critical suicidology. His commitment to equity has earned him awards for his involvement in queer, trans, and disabled communities, including the Canadian Disability Studies Association Tanis Stowe Francophone Award and the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion President's Award at the University of Ottawa. A prolific author who won the Young Researcher Award from the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Ottawa in 2023, he is the author of Undoing Suicidism, a trans, queer, crip approach to rethinking, in parentheses, assisted suicide, available in open access on the Temple University Press website. Today, he'll be speaking on a radical and critical approach to rethinking suicidality, reconceptualizing suicide prevention through the lens of suicidism. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Can everyone see my PowerPoint? All good, perfect. I would like to mention that all the images in my presentations are paintings from Paolo Troilo, an Italian finger painter. So I invite you to go see his work. This presentation is also drawn from several arguments presented in my book Undoing Suicidism, and it's freely available on my publisher's website. So please feel free to go check it out. And also many arguments I present today are drawn from different articles. You can see some of them there in English, some of them here in French for the Francophone and the Francophiles in the crowd. So it's all freely available on my academia page. And I would like to emphasize that while my approach to suicide and assisted suicide is radically different from those currently known, it's not intended to encourage suicide. On the contrary, I hope that the approach I propose will help reduce suicidality. And I also want to warn you that this presentation will deal with very sensitive topics. And this may trigger, of course, like some difficult and strong emotions for some people. So I have included crisis numbers and hotline numbers on this slide. I also put them in the box, the chat box, I believe it's accessible there. Perfect. So please feel free to take a screen capture or a photo if you need them. And before starting, I would like to specify that my use of the broader term suicidality refers to three things: suicidal ideations, suicide attempts, and completed suicide. So let's start. There have been more and more fundings dedicated to suicide prevention, public discussions on mental health issues, and campaigns inviting suicidal people to reach out to hotlines and counseling services to discuss their suicidality. At the same time, however, talking about your suicide as a suicidal person remains taboo. Leah Lakshmi Piepzna Samarasina, a queer, non-binary femme and disabled person of color who is an artist, writer, and educator on disability justice, demonstrates how suicidality remains taboo even in anti-oppression circles such as anti-racist, queer, trans, and disabled circles. So Piepzna Samarasina says, and I quote here, "If anyone came at me saying, 'Have you thought about killing yourself lately?' I'd automatically lie and say, 'Hell no,' the way I have to every single doctor, social worker, and most therapists in my life. Like any smart crazy, I don't want anything I can prevent on my permanent record, and I definitely don't want danger to self or others. I've been fighting this my whole life, and I've seen the oppression and the hardness that label can mean to folks. But if you normalize it, because it's normal, this secret that so many of us wrestle with suicidality, then maybe, just maybe, I'd tell you where I was at." So Piepsnas Almacinas identifies forms of ableism, insanism, the discrimination against people considered quote unquote insane and living with mental health issues, as key barriers preventing honest conversations about suicidality. While suicidality impacts all individuals and all communities, research shows that social determinants of health and power relations between privileged groups and marginalized communities influence the prevalence of suicidality. For example, Jeffrey Ensloss and Shanna Peltier indicate that suicide rates for Indigenous youth are tremendously higher than in the rest of the population. Indeed, in a report for Statistics Canada, we discover, for example, and I will read only the first sentence, suicide rates among First Nations people, Métis, and Inuit were significantly higher than the rate among non-Indigenous people. And some recent studies show that Inuit people in Canada experience suicide rates 6 to 25 times the national rates. Staggering numbers about suicidality can also be found in sexual and gender minorities. While rates of suicidality among lesbian, gay, bisexual, and queer people are quite high compared to their heterosexual counterparts, statistics comparing cisgender people, that is non-transgender people, and trans individuals are even more striking. So a 2016 study that you can see on the screen of more than 27,000 trans people in the US shows that, and here I quote, 40% have attempted suicide in their lifetime and 7% attempted suicide in the past year, nearly 12 times the rate in the US population. And these North American statistics are quite representatives of those on 2S LGBTQIA+ communities in other geographical contexts. There are even some studies in Australia that indicate that suicidality rates are up to 20 times higher for trans communities. So while the support needs of marginalized people experiencing distress are important, they remain, as is generally the case for suicidal people, unmet through current suicide prevention services. As I have shown in my work, the majority of current prevention services fail to reach suicidal people. And this failure is especially salient when it comes to those who are most determined to die or who belong to marginalized groups. For example, Curtis Wright, a self-identified Black, fat, non-binary queer femme, discusses in their blog how quickly suicidal people learn to lie and remain silent about their suicidal ideations to avoid negative consequences, particularly when they belong to marginalized communities such as Indigenous, racialized, queer, trans, and disabled and neurodivergent communities. Wright says, and I quote here, I called a suicide prevention hotline, not quite realizing that sometimes suicide prevention looks like emergency vehicles and mandatory hospital stays, when all you want, all you need is to talk. Making mostly false promises of personal safety, I ended up the phone call and learned to shut up about wanting to die. So this type of testimony is supported by a great deal of research demonstrating that suicidal people, particularly those from marginalized groups and those determined to die, do not feel safe to ask for help. In our interviews with 100 suicidal individuals, Susan Stephen concludes that they do not discuss their wish to die when they want to achieve their goal. And here I will quote Stephen, who says, many people who kill themselves often plan their suicide carefully and conceal those plans with great success from the people who know them best, including friends and family. The people I interviewed were unanimous in saying that the more determined they were to kill themselves, the more they concealed their intentions from the people in their lives. And I argue that this silencing effect also applies to healthcare, social services, and suicide prevention services. Suicidal people remain silent and they feel it's not safe to share their distress. Indeed, as empirical research shows, suicidal people, like those considered quote unquote mad or crazy, are institutionalized, incarcerated, drugged against their will, excluded from insurance programs, not hired for new jobs, or literally fired from their current ones, have their parental rights revoked, are seen as incapable of sound judgment, and are subjugated to many other unfair treatments. The horrific experience that some people go through as a result of disclosing their suicidal ideations are so difficult that many say, as is the case in Rodente and colleagues' study on trans-suicidal people, that they would prefer to die than to seek help and deal with negative consequences. So, among the factors that prevent marginalized people from seeking help are the fact that the service offered often increase forms of structural violence experienced by suicidal people, such as those founded on racism, colonialism, ageism, ableism, saneism, sexism, heterosexism, and cisgenderism. In that sense, and it's a little bit counterintuitive, but I argue that suicide prevention services do more harm than good. And in particular, I draw on some evidence as reported by transformative justice collectives such as Trans Lifeline. So for those of you who don't know this organization, it's a hotline dedicated to trans and non-binary people in distress in Canada and in the US that demonstrates how trans people experience particular forms of violence that are exacerbated by the use of these services. So Trans Lifeline refuses to call emergency services, 911 or the police, even when someone is actively suicidal and want to complete their suicide, unless the person consents to that intervention. So from that perspective, Trans Lifeline stand in stark contrast to other prevention lines, which rely on emergency services when deemed necessary. Trans Lifeline believes that non-consensual rescues carry greater risk for suicidal individuals. And here I have a quote from this organization. They say that they surveyed about 800 trans people across the US regarding their experiences with suicide hotline use. And approximately 70% stated that they had never called a suicide hotline. But over half of those specified that they had been in crisis, but did not feel safe calling a hotline. And approximately a quarter stated that they had interacted with law enforcement or emergency personnel as a result of a crisis call, while 1 in 5 had been placed on an involuntary psychiatric hold. So, Trans Lifeline argues that non-consensual rescue intensifies suicidality, in fact, due to the inhuman, harmful, and violent treatment imposed on suicidal trans subjects by police and healthcare providers. So following some of their observations, I identify a series of negative consequences associated with non-consensual rescues that affect various marginalized communities differently, such as trans communities. So we can do that exercise for multiple marginalized groups. Here I do it for trans people, and I summarize these negative impacts in 5 points. The first one is that those rescues often out trans people to their relatives and families, and such forms of outing can lead to further rejection, expulsion from the home, and violence. Second, those rescues involve fees of ambulance, hospitalization, etc. for trans people who are already overrepresented in statistics on poverty. Third, involuntary hospitalization and histories of mental health issues, and particularly suicidality, may negatively impact access to trans-affirmative healthcare by delaying or literally blocking care. Fourth, interaction with the healthcare system and social services often includes stigmatization and violence. And fifth, those rescues break the trust of potential hotline callers who may fear that the operators will initiate a non-consensual active rescue. So, in other words, a hotline that supports non-consensual suicide prevention measures, which is the case with 99.9% of hotlines and crisis line in North America, does not elicit trust, confidence, or honest sharing from suicidal people. And some, rather than finding the comfort, support, care, and listening they are looking for, a majority of marginalized people, as we just saw with this example with trans people, experience abuse, discrimination, microaggressions, trauma, and forms of incarceration as a result of reaching out for help, which seem counterproductive and unacceptable. So to date, scholarship has emphasized a range of solutions to reach marginalized suicidal people and to break the silence they experience, such as peer community support services, culturally competent prevention services, and of course, social, political, legal battles to improve the lives of marginalized groups in order to reduce their suicidality, which often use like intersectional approaches. And while I support these initiatives, which do wonderful work addressing structural violence that increase suicidality among marginalized groups, it's important to note that in these structural and intersectional analysis, one dimension that is of suicidality is completely absent and missing. Among the 2,000 references I consulted for my book, I did not come across any that dealt with suicidality as oppression. Yet, suicidal people experience specific oppression that is interlocked with other oppressions, such as transphobia, as we just saw, and that should be discussed when it comes to suicidality. And this literature is not the only one that do not theorize the oppression of suicidal people. In fact, it's such a forgotten experience that before I named this oppression and coined the term suicidism, nobody had talked about it in those terms. Yet, the media is replete with horrific stories of suicidal individuals facing inhuman treatment after expressing their suicidal ideations, from being hospitalized, drugged against their will, to being handcuffed and shot by police, a phenomenon very linked to racism and colonialism, by the way, to losing their job, to even being kicked off campuses such as this University of Toronto students a few years ago. So these stories illustrate that despite the supportive and compassionate rhetoric surrounding suicidality, based on the notion of risk, surveillance, and in the name of protecting vulnerable people from themselves, suicidal people who call for help do not always find the promised support and often experience harm. And while the literature has begun to expose some forms of discrimination against suicidal people, a detailed theoretical framework explaining the structural violence they experience and the political agenda that should be pursued to end this oppression has not yet been developed. So my book proposes this theoretical framework and this political agenda. The thesis I put forth is quite simple. It's the following: suicidal people experience and are oppressed by structural suicidism. So borrowing from other terms such as sexism and racism, I coined the neologism suicidism in 2016. And to give you a definition, so it refers to an oppressive system functioning at the normative, discursive, medical, legal, social, political, economic, and epistemic levels, a system in which suicidal people experience multiple forms of injustice and violence, such as discrimination, stigmatization, exclusion, pathologization, criminalization, and so on. Inspired by the notion of compulsory heterosexuality and the notion of compulsory able-bodiedness and able-mindedness theorized in disability, CRIP, and MAD studies, The theoretical framework on suicidism I propose allows for a rethinking of what I call compulsory aliveness. And I argue that compulsory aliveness represents the normative component of suicidism and includes various injunctions or imperatives, including what I've called the injunction to live and to futurity. So suicidism and compulsory aliveness are also linked to other oppressions such as ableism and saneism. And I contend that compulsory aliveness aims to impose a will to live and make some people's desire for death seem abnormal, inconceivable, unintelligible, except for those cast by dominant norms as unproductive, a burden, undesirable, unsalvageable, such as disabled, sick, ill, old people who are at the end of their lives. In their case, their desire for death is considered normal and rebranded as medical assistance in dying. The exceptionalism regarding the suicidality of disabled, sick, ill people has long been critiqued by disability activists and scholars. For example, Carol J. Gill dedicated several papers to what she calls selective suicide intervention. So when an able-bodied person expresses a wish to die, they are characterized as suicidal and targeted by suicide prevention interventions. But when this individual is disabled or ill, the desire to die is recast as rational. However, from a sanist perspective, suicidal people's desire for death is cast as irrational, crazy, mad, insane, alienated, and they are stripped of their autonomy, agency, decision-making capacity, and rights to consent to or to refuse healthcare in a curative process aimed to reintegrate them as normal and productive citizens into a neoliberal and capitalist economy. This is something my colleagues in previous papers this morning talked about. In fact, in many national legal contexts, a person is often forcibly institutionalized, physically restrained, and voluntarily drugged because they are simultaneously suicidal or perceived as such. It therefore becomes really hard to distinguish between the systems of oppression. Being suicidal itself is enough to be labeled crazy and mad. Being mentally ill requires a medical and psychiatric cure, and non-consensual treatments are seen as the norm when it comes to people who represent a danger to themselves. In other words, from an ableist, sanist, ageist, and capitalist perspectives, people who are seen as unsalvageable and unproductive are supported and even encouraged to die through assisted methods, as demonstrated by our laws on medical assistance in dying. At the same time, suicidal people seen as salvageable and having a potential productive future are explicitly excluded from these laws and forced by being constrained to hospital bed to stay alive. And it's important to mention that in all national contexts that allow some forms of assisted death, suicidal people are systematically excluded. Only people who are physically or sometimes mentally ill can have access to these procedures, and these laws specify that no suicidal person should ever be supported in their desire to die. So I see the creation of those two classes of suicidal subjects, that is one that is allowed to die and the other that is forced to live, as highly problematic. My work asks the following question: why are we offering assistance in dying to disabled, sick, ill, old people who, in the vast majority of cases, don't want to die but ask for better living conditions and are driven to despair by the lack of help, while those who really want to die, such as suicidal people, are denied any assistance and forced to die alone in atrocious conditions or simply forced to stay alive? In my work, I argue that this desire to cure suicidal people and to save their lives at all costs is embedded, I was mentioning it earlier, in compulsory aliveness and its injunction to live into futurity. And as a dominant system of intelligibility within a suicidist regime, compulsory aliveness masks its own historicity and mechanism of operation, which give life an apparently stable and natural character. Yet, this stability and this naturalness stem from performative statements about the desire to live. So by mobilizing Judith Butler's thesis on gender as performative, I see the desire to live as performatives as well, that is being socially constructed. Indeed, institutions, social policies, laws, practices, intervention, treatments, theories, discourses shape the desire to live and present it in a similar way to how we sometimes present gender, as if it were a natural, stable, unchangeable desire, whereas it results from norms, discourses, pressures, and practices that remain invisible, in this case within a suicidist regime. And reversely, the desire to die is pathologized and seen as abnormal. In the spirit of Sarah Ahmed's suspension of the presumption that happiness is necessarily a good thing for everyone, I wonder what kind of new relationship to suicidality and suicidal people could emerge if we let go of the injunction to live into futurity and suspend our adherence to compulsory aliveness. As Ahmed does it in relation to happiness, I'm interested in tracking the effects of the presence of compulsory aliveness on marginalized groups, including suicidal people, because the injunction to live into futurity is often used to justify the oppression of the most marginalized groups. So I asked, what does it mean in this context to have not only a happiness duty, but also a life duty, implemented through a vast array of mechanisms in carceral institutions in the name of cure and care? Ahmed believes that in a world focused on happiness, unhappiness becomes in some ways a right. And similarly, in suicidist societies that impose life through various forms of violence, I argue that death by suicide should become a right and a positive one. So the difference between a negative right and a positive one is the following. Negative rights usually involves a liberty to do something without the interference of others or the state, while positive rights involve obligations toward others or a duty to assist the person. The injunction to live and to futurity underlies the preventionist script that is present in almost every discourse and intervention strategy on suicidality. In the various models of suicidality that I review in my book in the chapter 1, so there is the medical model and psychiatric model, the biopsychosocial model, the public health model, the social justice model, as well as in the views of right to die activists, suicidal people must be kept alive. Indeed, even for those who support the right to die, medical assistance in dying remains out of questions for suicidal people. When it comes to suicidal people, surprisingly, everyone from right wing to left wing agrees that supporting their assisted suicide is not an option. And in the few cases where suicide is not seen as a negative action to be absolutely avoided, suicide is presented as a negative right that is a personal choice and decision with which we should not interfere, but not as a positive right that should be supported by the state and society. And this is precisely what my work challenges, because in my queer crip model, suicide becomes a positive right. However, I want to make clear that my approach is radically distinct from that of offering physician-assisted death for people for whom mental illness is the sole condition of their request. There's a lot of discussion in Canada right now about that, so this is not that. In my work, in fact, I advocate for the abolition of these discriminatory laws on medical assistance in dying and physician-assisted death that allows assisted suicide only for quote unquote special populations based on dominant norms of who should live or die. And I would like to see the creation of new laws and policies surrounding assisted suicide for all adults who have a stable desire to die, including suicidal people. In other words, my approach is not based at all on a physical or mental illness or disability diagnosis as the criterion for allowing assisted suicide. Of course, I'm not saying that current discourses, policies, interventions, suicide programs, or suicide hotlines based on this suicidist preventionist script never help anyone. Neither am I condemning suicidal people who search for cures, be they medical or social. I didn't reveal much about myself, but I'm part of the trans community, the queer community. I'm also a suicidal person since the age of 12. So I know how, as suicidal people, we can be desperate for any kind of cure, you know? But what I want to highlight here is how this suicide is creative logic anchored in compulsory aliveness cannot imagine anything other than prevention to help suicidal people. Suicidality needs to be eradicated completely. And my theoretical framework on suicidism unpacks this idea that the best way to help suicidal people is through the logic of prevention and cure. So it offers new radical ways for rethinking suicidality. So in lieu of this curative and carceral logic underlying the suicidist preventionist script, as well as the ableist, sanist, ageist logic of disposability fundamental to various rights to die discourse, I propose a queer crip model of suicide that offers positive rights and support for assisted suicide for suicidal people. And this assistance would be offered to suicidal people through a suicide affirmative approach and suicide affirmative healthcare. So I will unpack this a little bit more. My model is meant to, and this is important, complement, not supersede the fight against the systemic oppressions that influence suicidality in marginalized groups. This model puts forth the idea that fighting for social justice is not contradictory to greater accountability towards suicidal people. Both goals could be pursued simultaneously. It's not one or the other. Additionally, while the objective of my model is to provide more human, respectful, and compassionate support for suicidal people, rather than saving their lives at all costs, and this is very important, one of my hypotheses is that a suicide affirmative approach that supports assisted suicide for suicidal people, and it's counterintuitive, but it might actually save more lives than current prevention strategies. And you might wonder why. So because rather than being forced to die in silence and secrecy by completing their suicide without consulting anyone due to fear of experiencing suicidist consequences, suicidal people in this model would finally have the chance to speak freely and to benefit from an accompaniment process to reach an informed decision about their desire to live or die. So my anti-suicidist and suicide affirmative approach is inspired by trans affirmative approaches for trans people, and it's anchored in the values of anti-oppressive social movements such as intersectionality, bodily autonomy, self-determination, informed consent, and also harm reduction. A suicide affirmative approach does not mean pushing suicidal people to suicide, just as the goal of, as you know, the trans affirmative approach is not to force or push a person to transition. Rather, it means that instead of trying to cure trans people of their transness or suicidal people of their suicidality. We develop safer spaces in which we can examine their suicidality with them and discuss a wide variety of options. So my approach proposes to shift from a preventionist and curative logic to a logic of accompaniment for suicidal people, a form of support that could be both life-affirming and death-affirming. So this shift from prevention to accompaniment empowers suicidal people and offers them greater epistemic justice. Indeed, from a suicidist preventionist script and stance, other people, family, researchers, healthcare providers, hold the truth on suicide. Suicide needs to be prevented. The suicidal person should not be given a choice, and we implement choices made by others without consulting the first person concerned and without their consent. So from the preventionist point of view, life rather than the suicidal person and what they claim and feel is the priority. And so their epistemic authority is denied when it comes to matters of life and death. But in the anti-suicidist logic I propose, the epistemic authority switches hands. The suicidal person has the authority, and those around them are there to offer support. In other words, while from a suicidist preventionist script, there is a pre-identified goal and solution, saving lives, usually designed by non-suicidal people, my logic of accompaniment centers on the suicidal person to help them identify their own goals and solutions. So, and this is very important, in my approach, the priority is the suicidal person, not life itself. And I know that I'm arriving at 35 minutes, so I will be concluding my last slide. While the right to die by assisted suicide is almost always cast by anti-oppression activists and scholars as one of the most conservative and violent positions someone can endorse, the anti-suicidist and suicide-affirmative approach shows that supporting a renewed, radical, and critical form of assisted suicide does not go hand in hand with political conservatism and austerity thinking. So I will stop there. I invite you to contact me if you have questions. If you want to download the book, you have contact information there. And there you go. Thanks.